Don't you just love Majd's lack of bullshit? I wish we had like 5 hours to go into it.
Yes, we did it.
Levels. 1, 2, 3. Yo. In case you haven't heard, Berg & Co. have just massively updated Darkroom. And I mean, it has been updated in a major way. So if you're a Darkroom user, this is game-changing for you. I released a video just yesterday going into the whole update. It's about 11, 12 minutes long. It goes into how well it works, what it is, all that good stuff. And if you haven't seen it or you're not aware, I'll just recap it really quickly and then we'll get into my conversation with Darkroom co-founder Majd Taby. So it's Darkroom 6.2, Darkroom version 6.2. And the update is concerning the rendering engine, which is responsible for the graphics that you see on screen. But this update particularly pertains to the highlights, shadows, blacks, whites, and exposure sliders. They've been significantly updated. And if you haven't already watched my video, this will all make a lot more sense if you go and watch it, seriously. But before we get into Majd, a little bit of a story behind this conversation and the time of its recording. So Majd reached out to me back in May of this year, and he first showed me this update in May. And it was working really well back then. I thought it was like ready to go, but then I didn't hear anything. And then in September, the Darkroom guys reached out again and said, hey, we're looking to drop the update like anytime. Do you want to get on the beta? Maybe you want to make a video about it. It's like, yeah, thanks very much. Get me on the beta. So jumped on the beta, started testing it. And I'm like, I definitely want to make a video about this. So I started to write my script and test and research and all that sort of stuff as I do. Then I discovered a bug and I sent the information, I sent the screenshots and things and the raw files to the Darkroom team, and they were like, oh shit, yeah, you've discovered a bug, thanks for letting us know. So they fixed it, but that kind of messed my script up and changed the direction of my video. There's not a blame. I'm not blaming them whatsoever. It's no one's fault. This is just the reality and the workflow of making a video. So then Majd and I, we had this conversation. I invited him to talk with me about like 2 weeks ago. So the conversation you're about to watch was filmed 2 weeks ago after I'd found the bug and after they changed it and updated it to fix this bug. And then I made my Darkroom video about a week ago. I uploaded it, published it yesterday for you guys, and now I'm filming this intro today, which is a few days before you get it. Is that too much behind the scenes? If I just confused you all. Anyway, the point is, when Majd and I had this conversation, I hadn't actually made my Darkroom video yet. That's what I'm trying to get at. I thought you might be interested, though, in the behind the scenes a bit more. Anyway, let's get to Majd and enjoy our conversation. Look at you in 4K, just showing off. Showing off. Okay, so Majd, here we are back again for a second time. Another update to your wonderfully popular Darkroom app. How's it going? Thanks for taking the time.
It's going great. Thank you for having me back on. Hopefully, I won't bore your listeners with too many repeated information. But it's great to be back, and it's great to talk to you again.
No, same. After I spoke with you last time, it was in May, and you just released the masks. And actually, I had my first in-person encounter with a listener who approached me, and he said, "You don't know me." And but I listened to your podcast on the train down here. So
oh wow,
yeah, I know, and that was the first time that had ever happened to me. And I'm thinking the same thing as you about, God, am I just boring people? Are they actually interested in this thing? But I got some confirmation from this encounter that we were very entertaining. And when people are asking me questions about stuff I spoke about, that always blows my mind that there's a human. I'm staring into a black void now, and I know you're doing the same, but there's actual humans on the other end of this.
Yeah.
So
so you're saying no pressure?
No pressure. There are people, Majd.
There are people on the other end of this. Don't let anyone down.
No. Hey, I mean, I'm not going to want to speak to someone who's likely to let someone down. I will be the one letting people down, not you. Don't worry.
No. There's a reason why we're all here listening and talking to you.
Oh,
You
bless
haven't
you.
let us down yet. Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't know. My schedule over the past year has probably let a few people down, but we'll try and improve that going forward. So speaking of going forward, you've got a brand new, well, it's brand new for us anyway, and I'm sure it's months in the making for yourself, perhaps even over a year. I don't know. We'll get into it. Darkroom has a new rendering engine. Is that correct? Is there anything else going on?
Well, Darkroom has had two big updates, kind of back to back, and like we the first was preset sharing, but the second one is a massive rebuild of a good chunk of our rendering engine. And then we'll talk about this nuance a little bit later in the podcast, I think, or hopefully, but it's the same rendering engine, but we've completely gutted and replaced 5 sliders implementation. So that's exposure, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And anyone who's used Lightroom in the past knows how much time you spend in those sliders and how important they are. And anytime who spent time in Darkroom knows how lackluster they could be and how frustrating they could be to use. And so we've been working on this for 6 months actively and a few months before doing some research and development. So it's probably the biggest amount of time we've spent on one individual update. But I mean, hopefully people will agree with me that I think the results speak for themselves. Yes, it is it's a major change to a core part of the rendering engine. But there's still more work to do. But this is about like the biggest step that you're going to see in Darkroom for a while.
Absolutely, it's massive. Anyone who hasn't used it yet, I mean, I was just blown away when you first showed me this. Yeah, and as you say, it's getting better and better all the time, as we'll get into. But before we carry on, I have a basic understanding, I'm not going to lie, of what a rendering engine is. I know I have a British accent, so I sound intelligent, but can you please educate myself on what a rendering engine is at my level?
Sure. So a rendering engine in its most simple description is it's a kind of a catch-all term. It's a little bit of a meaningless phrase in itself, but it's a phrase that's convenient for us to use when we describe transforming raw in, like, not when I say raw, I mean lowercase RAW, not like the file format, but like plain like image data, whether it's a JPEG file or a DNG file with actual sensor information, converting that binary data into RGB pixel values that can be, in this case, because it's a rendering engine, rendered onto a file or rendered onto the screen. So as you well know, when you're capturing in HEIC or in JPEG, the camera is taking information from the sensor, applying a compression algorithm onto it, and saving that to a file. That information in the JPEG file is not the first pixel has a red value of this and a green value of this and a blue value of this. It's a compressed binary format that has to be decoded into an actual image. And then, like, the simplest rendering engine would be to just open it, decode it, and render it on screen in an image view, right? Like, that still could be considered a rendering engine, but it's just a really simple one that doesn't do much. Then when you're entering the context of something like Darkroom, okay, well, the file you're opening might be a raw file, in which case, a DNG file, which contains raw sensor data, which needs to be interpreted and then needs to be processed and optimized. And then you have a bunch of sliders you might be manipulating to affect the values of those pixels, right? And so the rendering engine is a catch-all term for interpreting file data, rendering it onto the screen, and manipulating it in the middle. So, like, the rendering engine is all those parts put together in a box.
I see. So we have input box with rendering engine written on it, and then output screen, basically.
Yep, or file if you're exporting. Yep.
Yeah, or a file.
And that's its most like fundamental point aspect, like what a rendering engine is. And different companies will build different ones. Apple provides technologies for you to have your own. If you're Lightroom, you have a rendering engine. If you're Darkroom, you have a rendering engine. You've built your own. The code and logic that lives inside of that box is proprietary. And so depending on which application you use, different companies will produce different results. And I think the thing that's potentially non-intuitive about rendering engines is that a lot of these sliders and a lot of these tools, they're abstract interfaces that hide lots of little knobs internally. And then all these little knobs are tuned by people like us who are building the rendering engine. And so when you adopt a rendering engine of a certain company, you're not only adopting their technology, you're also adopting their subjective choices made in the development of those, in the tuning of those knobs, in the prioritization they put around how things work, what aesthetic qualities you want. So the rendering engine as a whole enforces a lot of creative decisions on you and gives you the space to play within them. But it definitely is an opinionated piece of software.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you obviously updated Darkroom in the past. Was there any sort of special, more challenging R&D to take it from where it was to where it is this time around?
Yeah. So from like the first version of Darkroom that launched in 2015 up until we launched Clarity, every tool to manipulate images in Darkroom was actually pretty simple. It was just, here's a curve, you want to apply a curve to it, similar to how the curves tool, if you do like an S curve, you increase the contrast in a photo. The tools were kind of like simple, general purpose like that. Once we started getting into things like Clarity and now highlight and shadow recovery, what you're trying to manipulate is the structure of the image itself. And what I mean by that is you're trying to understand what's happening in the image in terms of texture, in terms of frequency. So what I mean by frequency is if you have like a clear blue sky, that's a low frequency part of the image where not much is happening from pixel to pixel. Like the pixel and its neighbors are similar to each other. But if you have a field of grass in the horizon, that's a high frequency portion of the image where each pixel might be like catching the highlight of a blade of grass, and then the next pixel is the underside of the blade of grass, and it's much darker, and it goes back and forth, and it's more interesting, right? There's more textural detail. And when you're talking about tools like Clarity and highlight and shadow recovery, you're trying to analyze the image. You're trying to understand what's happening in the image, and the algorithms that you're building become image specific, and they become tuned at real time to the actual needs of that specific image. And that's one of the things that's really difficult and much more challenging about building things like highlight and shadow recovery and Clarity, as opposed to something like a brightness slider or a temperature slider. With those tools, you're just performing the same operation on every pixel on every image. There's much less intelligence there. With something like highlight and shadow recovery, where when you open the photo in Darkroom, we're actually analyzing it. We're generating image statistics. We're understanding the distribution of pixel values in it. We're generating multiple histograms because things like shadow recovery are actually spatially aware. So if you have a single photo with a clear blue sky and a field of grass, the single slider will behave differently in those different parts of the image. And so we need to break the image down, understand its different characteristics, and tune the algorithm for each specific photo. And then you've got raw photos and JPEG photos. You've got bright photos, dark photos. You've got highlights, shadows, blacks, whites, and exposure. And you need to tune each algorithm for each image type, for each portion of the image. And then part of what we did was kind of a clean sweep of, we still have more work to do here, but we did a clean sweep of where the data is coming from and how it's being passed through the pipeline in the rendering engine. Making sure that we don't clip any data, we don't lose any data as we process it. So we're always operating as high fidelity as possible. All these things are introducing challenge. And also, by the way, you're operating on an iPhone, don't forget that somebody might be running it on an iPhone 7 Plus, which is a memory constrained environment, or an iPhone SE, which we still support. And so you have to make sure you're not using too much memory, it stays fast enough. And that's where a lot of the challenges come into actual development of something like this.
Oh my gosh. I wish we had 5 hours to go into all this stuff. Seriously. I need to come and pay you a visit one day and
Absolutely. I'd love that.
Take you out for a coffee and you can just take me through all this. I want to see where you do your R&D and just absorb it all. It's
A lot of time in
Fascinating.
MATLAB. Yeah.
So you don't just like click a button and your sliders appear, is what you're telling me?
Oh, what did it work so simple?
Yeah.
No, it's yeah. There's a lot of stuff behind under the hood, and one of the reasons why this specific iteration on these sliders took so much longer than everything we've done in the past is because you'd have 100 raw photos or 200 raw photos that we're using as like a test bed, right? These are photos that in the process of developing we found particularly problematic. And so we have this album, and then we make a change to our algorithm, to our curves, to our like knobs that I was describing. And then you try it, and for 75 photos that you try it on, it's perfect. And then you get to the 80th photo, and it introduces like a weird artifact because the sensor picked up some random noise and it threw off your calculations.
Right.
And so it's especially if you're like in the past, we were primarily focused on iPhone JPEGs. And so the variance from photo to photo is limited because you're using the same camera on the same device and everything is calibrated so that it produces the same image. Now that we're like really digging into all the different raw formats and like all the different cameras that you're using to capture raw photos, if you're using a Sony camera or a Nikon camera or a Canon camera or a Fuji camera, the characteristics of the raw file is different. The way they handle noise in really dark areas and really bright areas is different, and that all impacts how we process the image. So lots and lots of back and forth testing, it feels like a lot of times it feels like playing whack-a-mole where you're like, okay, like fix this problem, but introduce this other problem, fix that problem. Well, now there's this problem. It was a lot like that.
Yeah, I'll bet it was. So when you decided to make these changes, was there a specific goal in mind that you had for it, and then you sort of worked backwards from there, or did you just start building it and then achieve a level you were happy with it? Which one of those two was your approach?
Yeah, so we definitely always start, anytime we do anything, whether it's in the rendering engine or in the UI of the app, we always start with an end goal because that's how you know you're done and that's how you know you're making progress along the correct direction. Otherwise, you're just kind of like flailing around. You don't know if what you're doing will work or not. And so when we started working with highlights and shadow recovery, the standard bearer in our industry is Lightroom. Like what Lightroom does is considered to be as good as you can get. There aren't a lot of people who are super frustrated with the quality of shadow recovery in Lightroom. Like to put it
it's insane, isn't it?
It's quite good.
Yeah, it's quite good. Yeah.
However, when we were kind of like exploring what different applications do, we did basically like a study, a comparative study of all the different like photo editing apps, especially like the high end ones. We noticed that while Lightroom we thought had the best recovery, we always found that the photos and you ended up with when you're using shadow and highlight recovery had an HDR effect. The clarity seemed to be punched up and the mid-tone contrast seemed to be punched up enough because they want to maintain the structure of the image. But you always ended up with a photo that had a little bit too much clarity for our taste. And when we compared it to some other applications where the shadow or highlight recovery might not have been as good, you still ended up with a much more natural looking image. And that's one of the things that we really wanted in Darkroom, especially in highlight and shadow recovery. We wanted to maintain, like, if there's a dark part of the photo, if the photo is dark, we want you to recover shadows, but we want the photo to still be dark. We don't want a shadow slider to change the exposure of the entire image. And so like the overall structure of the image we wanted to maintain. If the scene was flat, we wanted to maintain some flatness to it. We didn't want to just like make it look like someone slapped like clarity plus 80 on this image. And our thinking there was if you wanted that HDR look, you still have the clarity slider. You can still add mid-tone contrast beyond what we thought you needed. So that was our main artistic aesthetic direction, is the same amount of recovery as Lightroom, but without the HDR effects. Now, what's a couple of interesting things when it comes to Lightroom is, and we noticed this when we compared it to other apps, sometimes in Lightroom, the sliders don't do anything. Sometimes depending on what the histogram is, it's like, oh, you should have been moving blacks, not shadows, or oh, you should actually like should have moved. You move shadows so much that now blacks doesn't do anything. And I think photographers who care enough to understand what's happening can explain why that's the case. But in the context of Darkroom, people might not have a histogram open, and so they're just having a slider that doesn't do anything. And so we wanted to make sure that, like in Darkroom, you don't have that problem, that UX problem of a slider that doesn't do anything. And so that manifests itself into the algorithm itself. So for example, in Darkroom, when you increase the shadows to boost the amount of like shadow recovery in the dark parts of an image, we try to keep the blacks very dark. We try to keep the really, really dark parts of the image dark. And that's for two reasons. The first is because we want to maintain the overall tone range and like tonality of the image, and we want to respect that. Because if you wanted the darkest part to be brighter, you would be moving exposure. Or if you want to maintain the highlights and shadows, the highlights and the midtones where they are, you would move the blacks if you really want to dig deep into the histogram. And so we wanted to make sure that the shadows and the black sliders and symmetrically highlights and whites work well together. So that like if you really didn't want any dark blacks, you would move both shadows and blacks. And if you same for highlights and whites. So those were some of the decisions that we made that would be diverging from what Lightroom does. And lastly, we noticed that there were times where Lightroom was actually more conservative than we want it to be in terms of recovery, especially when it comes to JPEGs, especially when it comes to like really dark photos. And the reason simply is really dark JPEGs are compressed images. And when you try to boost the shadows too much, you risk introducing compression artifacts, which are really ugly. Like you really don't want them. It's like a big, like bright green square in the middle of like a dark sky. You know, like it just is it's bizarre.
Yeah.
But we found that Lightroom can be a little bit too conservative over there, and so there are times where we made choices to actually be more aggressive in our shadow recovery than Lightroom. So that's kind of what I mean in terms of you have a lot of knobs inside of this rendering engine, and like we have to make 1,000 of those decisions. But at the end of the day, it's a slider. You move it up, and your shadows are brighter. It's just when you put them next to each other, are you happy with that result or are you not?
It's fascinating. The end user just, like you say, move slider, shadows get brighter. But behind that slider, there's so much time and effort that goes in. And that's what I try and bring to my reviews. Not empathy, but like an understanding and an appreciation of what's gone into these things.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, I can get a little bit more technical about how these work under the hood if you're interested. I don't know if like that's the level. I don't know if that's where you want to take the conversation.
I like to challenge. I'm learning so much.
Yeah, so this is actually quite fascinating. It was interesting to me because my background is app development and user interface design. It's not image processing and computer vision, and so I have to rely on team members that I have to like really elevate our technical understanding of these things. And this is something that I find fascinating. And this is something again like. To speak to the point you just made, the user just the photographer is just moving up the shadow slider. It's a pretty simple, straightforward interface. But under the hood, we actually have 3 algorithms that are working in conjunction with each other. So the first one is a simple curve, but that operates on the luminance channel. Like this way, you have an RGB curve in Darkroom, and if you move the shadows up, it makes the shadows brighter. It's a similar thing, and that's like the most basic, simple way of just boosting your shadows. The problem with that, as I'm sure you're aware, is you end up, if you want to keep the rest of the photo as it is, so if you don't want to increase the exposure of the entire photo, you end up flattening part of the curve where the shadows turn into the midtones. It ends up being flattened. And then all the colors that are bright shadows get pushed into flat midtones. And then you just end up with kind of like a loss of detail and loss of fidelity and loss of definition in the middle part of your photo. So to counteract that, that's a natural fundamental reality that like anytime you want to boost the luminance of dark areas, you're going to have to fight. To counteract that, we have a second algorithm. It's called the Clawhay algorithm, which stands for Contrast Limited Adaptive Histogram Equalization. Anyway, it's a long name. You can look it up and look at the images on Google after listening to this. But what it does is it's like rudimentary apps use this algorithm instead of clarity. And what it does is it has a clarity-like effect where the midtone contrast is boosted. It tends to look unnatural, which is why we use a different algorithm for clarity in Darkroom. But in your head, you can kind of imagine someone taking clarity up on the whole image. When you take clarity up on the whole image, things that are close to each other get pushed farther apart. It's like increasing the contrast on the texture of the image, right? And when you do that for the whole image looks flat and looks unnatural. And so what we do is we break the image down into sections. We analyze the histograms for each section, and then we choose how much of the fake looking image we pull in, and we blend it so that it looks naturally, but in a way that reintroduces extra contrast in those areas we just flattened. So step 1 is increase luminance, but it causes a flattening. Step 2, reintroduce contrast where we flattened it, but only in the midtones. And then step 3 is this kind of blows my mind. We generate what is called a gradient map. And so it's like an image that is the same size as the source image that you opened, but each pixel is it's a black and white image, and each pixel, it represents how different it is from its neighbors. Right? And so if it's a clear blue sky, each pixel is going to be very similar to its neighbors, and so it'll be a dark pixel. If it's a field of grass, each pixel is going to be very different than the pixels around it, and it will in the gradient map it'll be a very bright pixel. And we use that to analyze areas of the image that are high frequency, highly textured, and areas of the image that are low frequency and untextured. And what we do is we actually boost the midtones and the highlights in those highly textured areas to maintain contrast in them. So for example, if you take a picture of a tree that's dark, that's an area where if you boost the shadows, even like the contrast limited, like the fake looking intense algorithm won't pull in a lot of details. And so you need to actually just change the curve in those areas specifically to bring up highlights and midtones. And that protects the texture in your photo. And all of these things are happening at the same time as you're moving shadows, depending on like different areas of the image and different characteristics of the image. So it's crazy.
Wow. I had a follow-up point, but my mind has just gone completely blank. Yes, that was it. And this wasn't present in the previous version of Darkroom. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. So in the previous version of Darkroom, what we had was a much more rudimentary version of highlight and shadow recovery, which was a curve operating. It was the first part of what I described, which was the curve. We had a curve that when you increase shadows, we boost the shadows, and you decrease highlights, we reduce the highlights. But if you do both in Darkroom, as it existed before this update, you'd end up with just everything that is not dark or bright was just gray. So you lost a lot of detail. So that's obviously not ideal, and that doesn't happen anymore. But the previous version was just very, very rudimentary.
It certainly doesn't happen anymore. It certainly doesn't. I can attest.
It doesn't.
To that.
And I think if you try to compare Darkroom to other popular iPhone photo editors, especially for raw detail recovery, you'll see might be why it it's actually like a really difficult, challenging problem to solve that only Lightroom has really solved well, other than us in our testing. There might be others, but I've only tested the popular ones that people typically use in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I haven't used all the apps, but I mean, you're what, 4 guys? I think
5 now.
5. Oh, nice. Well, there's no excuses anymore. Compared to Adobe, this, it's $1 billion behemoth, as you say. So, it's. I'm not going to review a Darkroom or expect the same from a Darkroom as I am from an Adobe. But as you say, when people use this new version, it just brings a smile to my face. If you haven't watched my review, there's a lot of smiling and wow going on as I'm.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much, David.
No, absolutely. One question: Well, there's a couple more questions, but how would you compare the results you get from all these new algorithms under the umbrella of this new rendering engine compared to, say, the old Darkroom and working with luminance masks to counteract the issue of the old rudimentary system?
So I want to make sure I understand your question correctly. You're saying in the old version of Darkroom, you would use luminance masks to try to select the bright areas of the image and reduce maybe the exposure there because you couldn't rely on highlights to do that for you.
Exactly. And then vice versa, yeah.
Yeah, so basically you shouldn't need to use luminance masks anymore to correct for exposure. The sliders themselves should work as expected, especially for shadow recovery. Highlight recovery for most images will work really well, but we're still struggling a little bit with really blown out highlights, where with covering them still we struggle in like really maintaining the saturation and structural integrity of those details. And the reason for that is the parts of the rendering engine we didn't update.
So just go to a little bit of behind the scenes for you good folks, because I'm 100% honest, Scouts on it. Majd and I are having technical difficulties, and he cut out and he was talking about how you don't have to use luminance masks anymore. Now, honestly, I don't think luminance masks can compare to what Darkroom can do now, because there's always that edge with the luminance mask where it's a great tool, but it doesn't quite, and you see the edge on a dark part. But Majd, if you had anything else to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only takeaway I wanted to give to people to kind of like manage expectations is and this, what I'm about to say only applies to raw photos that have blown out highlights, is that what I would recommend is if first of all, try to highlights in the white sliders, see how much you can recover. If you're happy, great. But there are in certain image types where the highlights are really blown out, it's better to use exposure to decrease it a little bit to bring some of that detail in and allow the highlight and shadow, the highlight and white sliders to really shine. And the unfortunate reality there is the fix for that requires a rebuilding of all the other parts of the rendering engine that we didn't touch in this update. And that's actually what we're working on next. So there's going to be another big rendering engine update that's going to affect not so much how the sliders behave, but how the app feels. And so that's coming next year. We're going to start working on it soon. And then the fix for the highlight issue is unfortunately more fundamental than we had time for in this project. So it's for JPEGs, it's magical. It's as magical as shadows are. For most raw photos, it's as magical as shadows are. But I'm just leaving this disclaimer so that like if people aren't confused when they see that, and give people an out of how to get around the issue.
You heard it here first, folks. There's another big update coming. No pressure now, because you just described it as another big update, Majd. So. All right, no, that's funny. And I was saying to Majd just when we went off, and I'm trying to fix what's going on here. Don't you just love Majd's lack of bullshit? Like, he's just so straightforward about, this isn't quite working right now, and we're trying to fix it. And isn't that so refreshing in a world of just bullshit, basically? Like, people trying to put a spin on things and create a narrative and gaslight you. And Majd is just, this is why I like him a lot, and
Thank you so much, David.
I like speaking to him.
And that's part of the benefit of being an independent bootstrap company, right? Like it's only the five of us. We're trying to make the best tool that we can. We think we're doing an excellent job with this update, and like this is an opportunity on this podcast to reach out to people who don't have the opportunity to talk to me normally, and just be like, hey, listen, like, you're going to run into this issue. We're aware of it. It's going to get fixed. Because what we're asking people to do with Darkroom is to switch their workflows, right? And like, you might be using Lightroom and you've gotten so used to managing separate libraries, paying double for storage, duplicating photos on your phone, importing, exporting, all these things. You might be so like kind of accustomed to that. Because you feel like you have to. That's like a tax you have to pay to have access to these tools. And what we're trying to tell people is like, you don't have to pay that tax to have access to these tools. You can have excellent tools for your iCloud photo library without paying the import tax. But like, that's a tall order, right? To ask someone to switch what they're using to something else. And so I think we need to go above and beyond what's expected of a company like Adobe or Apple to say like, no, like, trust me, like, it's good.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to just trust you. This is what I'm here for, not to be your marketing department, just to give the people an honest look before they part with their dollars or euros or their whatever. Here's what you can expect, and here's what you can achieve from this thing that you're putting out there. And I have a question around that. I think it's my last question. Next thing is, like, personally, I think this is going to be like a huge milestone in Darkroom's history. Where do you think it ranks in the scheme of things?
So we've had 3 big milestones, and I think this is the 4th. The first milestone was adding support for raw editing, which we did back before you really could do that. We were one of the first apps to add support for that in like 2017, I think we did it. It's like basically as soon as you could, we did. The second one was the iPad. We were one of the first photo editing apps that allowed you to like really take advantage of iCloud photo library on the iPad. Everyone else had like the simple like tap to import, and you get like the standard photo picker, and you pick one photo and you're editing one photo at a time, which for a photographer is just like a no-go from the beginning. It's just not even worth anything. Everything else is not worth looking at if that's what you have to do to get a photo in. Yeah. And the third one was masks. And I think masks in Darkroom was transformation of what people could do and the kinds of edits people create in Darkroom. And I think this is the 4th big one. And to me, it would rank on par with adding raw photo editing. So maybe like the first, the most or second most important update we've ever had. Because if I sit down with 10 people who tried Darkroom and stopped using Darkroom, or were fans of Darkroom, used it to fall in love with photography, started taking their photography more seriously, and then stopped using Darkroom, is because they started shooting more raw and then were disappointed by the quality of highlight and shadow recovery, because highlight and shadow recovery is so fundamentally critical to a raw editing workflow that like if you're using Darkroom and you're using raw, you can't use Darkroom for editing raw in any serious capacity. And I think that's a narrative that you went through. Is that right?
Yeah, something similar, especially as an iPhone shooter. You know what these iPhone RAW files look like straight out of the camera. They're not great. Even in the slightest scene with a slight exposure range, you need to do massive boosting or recovery, as you say.
Yeah, and so I think we're eliminating one of the key ways that people stop using Darkroom, and that's huge for us as a business, right? And like things like this being big for our business doesn't mean we get to stuff extra cash in our pockets, which we don't. We use that to hire people, like the people who build highlights and shadows that bring technical expertise to Darkroom to elevate the quality of what we can do. And you know, if our goal is to be the premier photo editing and library management tool for mobile photographers. If you're a mobile photographer, you take iCloud Photo Library seriously as your home for your photography, Darkroom should be the default photo editing app. That's for all your photo editing and management needs. That's our goal. That doesn't mean we replace Lightroom because you still have like a massive hard drive with all your archive in it that you don't want to put in iCloud Photo Library. Even I use both. One for my iCloud Photo Library, I use Darkroom. For my archive on my hard drives, I use Lightroom. But the two need to be on par, and the two need to be as useful for their respective libraries as the other. So that's the threshold that we put for each other, for ourselves. But highlight and shadow recovery was the biggest missing component as far as table stakes. And once, we have maybe a couple more, but once those are done, then we're on to all the new amazing things we can do to differentiate mobile photography from classic photography. And we're really excited to get into that.
You were kind enough to show me this back in May after we last spoke, and I was blown away then. You've openly said previously it was quite rudimentary, the way Darkroom handled highlights and shadows. Did you always know it was rudimentary, and did you always have that itch to fix it, or is it a response to user feedback?
No, we knew it was not ideal. It was always been a big source of anxiety for me. It was a bit of a source of embarrassment when I was talked to like a photographer who would open a raw photo and you don't have to spend a lot of time in Darkroom before you see what it's doing and be like, it's not great. And we don't really have an answer to that. Like, it isn't. Like, it just wasn't. Like, there's no, for me to tell you otherwise would be just to be lying to myself before I'm even lying to you about it. So we knew that was the case. I think, however, you know this better than anyone. When you're shooting on an iPhone, it's really hard to take an underexposed photo, and it's really hard to take an overexposed photo. You have to like enable settings and then interact with the screen while taking the photo to really tell it, please, like make this dark for me, because by nature, it's taking multiple exposures. It's, doing like photonic engine stuff, trillions of operations a second to try to make sure you don't have like, there's hundreds of engineers working for the past decade to make sure your photo is not underexposed when you're shooting on an iPhone. And so most iPhone photographers aren't limited by the issues we had with highlight and shadow recovery in the past, which is why we've been able to thrive as a business for the past 7 years. Wow. Took a while to do the math on that one.
Wow.
But I think the future of Darkroom is much more serious, much more raw. Well, you see it now happening with iPhone 14 Pro, with the Pro RAW and the 48 megapixel camera, and the amount of detailed information that's captured at the sensor. I mean, it's massive. I don't know if you have a 14 Pro and you've been shooting at 48 megapixels, but it's crazy. And so we think that's going to be more and more and more of an issue. And so we're happy with the timing that, like, as the Pro RAW is coming out and the iPhone 14 Pro is new, Darkroom is kind of like matching that and stepping up to be the best home for your Pro RAW photos.
Yeah, kind of meant to be. That's that's nice. The Halide guys always joke around this time of year that is Apple about to announce something that's going to put us out of business? But with you, it's the opposite. They've announced something that's like, that's helped you, like, essentially, just like you said there. I said to you when we last spoke that in order to use Darkroom, I had to change my workflow to get around these limitations, and I embraced these limitations rather than criticizing them in my reviews. But you didn't like that, and now you've answered that point, haven't you, with this new update?
Yeah, exactly right. I think people like you understand what makes Darkroom special, and it's the workflow. It's like how easy it is to use, how fast it is to use, how seamless it is to use, how much you can get into the flow editing while you're in Darkroom. And like, don't take my word for it. Take David's word for it, or just try it yourself, right? Like, try to edit a collection of 10 photos and try to get into the flow of doing it. Like, it's really difficult to do that in other apps. And that's where we spend a lot of our energy on. Like, we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to get Darkroom to be the complexity of Darkroom hidden from photographers. And so I think you understood that, and you understood the promise and the benefit of that. And you also, like, understood that, like, at the end of the day, you're trying to tell a story, and these are just tools to tell a story with your photography. And so correct me if I'm wrong, I'm kind of like speaking on your behalf here, but this is how I interpreted your initial review, which is the existing implementation of highlight and shadow recovery in Darkroom created this kind of muted, slightly faded aesthetic that is what's the word I'm thinking for? It's something people want. It's it's something that people would like to achieve, is this faded, kind of like crushed detail look. And the thing that I was always wanted to say when you said that last time, but I couldn't say it because we were still working on highlight and shadow recovery and it wasn't available, is I want you to I want to give you the tools to create that aesthetic because you want to, not because you have to adopt that aesthetic, right? And so, like, in Darkroom, you can still recreate the same look that you had with the old implementation of highlight and shadows, if that's what you want. But you can do that without using highlights and shadows, using the proper tools for that, which might be curves, it might be the fade slider, right? And the reason that it's important is because if your photo's underexposed, you want to fix that. You don't want to just, like, not use Darkroom and just, like, end up with an underexposed photo, because that's the best we could do.
Yeah. No, I fully get that. But dude, like, full disclosure, and I haven't even filmed my review at the time that we're having this conversation, but from what I've seen so far, like, I'm switching back 100%.
Yes, we did it. We did it.
I've been, just like I say, just amazed 100% of what you've achieved. And
thank you so much.
I haven't,
and go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I haven't used, the only reason I'm still using Lightroom is so I can compare it to Darkroom, because I know people will want to have that question answered.
Yep. Yep. And we're actually like doing that in our we've announcement as well. So like the announcement, we're putting Darkroom versus Lightroom, and you'll see what I described earlier in our conversation. Like, yes, they have more mid-tone contrast, but like you can do that in Darkroom by increasing clarity. Darkroom maintains like the structure of the format as it was in the original version. But yeah, it's like I want people to hold us to a high standard as well. Like if so. Part of me is just like, okay, hold us to a high standard, but also acknowledge what we're good at today. So it's like, yeah, like you can say highlight and shadows aren't good, but like don't end a review there, because there's like 100 other things we do better than everybody else, which is why we won an Apple Design Award, which is why we've been around for 7 years, right? Which is why we have a 4.8 star rating on the App Store after all this time. But yeah, as the developer behind the app, I want it to be the best at everything. With the constraints of resources and time, you have to choose what you're best at, and we're slowly chipping away at all the reasons why someone would want to leave, such that we bring you back in, because all the other stuff that's better, you can like come back and get it and not have to pay the recovery cost.
Mm-hmm. No, well, it's working. It's absolutely working 100%, and I can't wait to start using it more and more often and share my results and things like that.
And your presets.
And the presets.
Sure.
One final thing I'm very curious about, and I've always been curious about this, is like you've been kind enough to share like pre-release things with me in the past, and which is very nice of you. And I am currently working on a video that's going out that's going to be going out hopefully around the same time, probably maybe even on the same day. Hit people with a double whammy video on the same day. And I'm curious as to what effect that has on uptake of Darkroom, people using it. My making videos, I mean, not just me, but YouTubers in general.
Yeah. So unfortunately, Apple doesn't give us a lot of attribution mechanics between a YouTube video and an app install. And there's just no way for me to know that this person who installed this app came from a YouTube video. And typically, the thing that makes this more complicated when you've been around the App Store for as long as we have is Apple's constantly featuring and promoting and then taking you off of promotion here and there. But we're available internationally in 15 languages, which means this can happen 15 times throughout a day across different markets. And so we'll have natural fluctuations in the number of installs and purchases made in Darkroom. However, these kinds of like mentions on YouTube channels, especially ones like yours, they serve two purposes. The first is awareness of things that are new, and we see that in the comments. So like we obviously like try to see if anyone's talking about Darkroom on YouTube, and we'll read the comments, and the trust people have in you, and like your audience trusts you and your opinion to tell them what you believe. Whereas like when people come and watch me in Darkroom, just like, okay, well, we're getting, no matter how much I try to be transparent, it's still the Darkroom person on the Darkroom channel talking to you about Darkroom. Like there's a conflict of interest there, right? No matter how I try to be as honest as possible, like I am with you here, but still, it's different when it comes from you, because people build that trust with you over time. What you think influences what the community at large thinks about Darkroom. And that's why an update like this is so important for us. And that's why I wanted to share it with you, is because I knew that you mentioned you had stopped using Darkroom because of the highlight and shadow recovery was lackluster, and you were adopting more of a raw workflow, which again, I have no argument against at the time, and I still don't have an argument against it. But I was just like, okay, well, if we fix that problem, we want to make sure that you know about it and your audience knows about it, but we also want your narrative arc of I stopped using Darkroom and I've adopted it to be part of the narrative of this release. And so you help set the tone for the Darkroom brand. And that's why it's really important. That's why it's also like really stressful, right? Like we get really like nervous as an app builder whenever we see a review, because it's like, oh, like how is this? Are we gonna have to react to this? Is it gonna be a good one or a bad one? Do we agree or disagree? Do we have to set the record straight on something? And then the last thing I'll say is, compared to a paid sponsorship or compared to a paid placement or an advertisement in a video, an honest, unpaid, I think this is good, and I think my community will enjoy learning about this, is so much more powerful because it's honest, right? I have zero editorial control over what you do or what you say. You can just delete this and say, I don't think my audience wants this. I'm like, I can't stop you, right? And so like you speaking well of Darkroom is better than any ad we can buy in terms of the business. And we do see small bumps and bigger bumps depending on like any variety of factors, like if YouTube algorithm picked it up or something like that, or how dominant Darkroom was as a focus of a video. We definitely see that reflected in our business as well, which is really great to see. So, it's like that helps us grow the company, which helps us continue investing in it. And I think that's the thing that kind of I wish more people understood is like when we switch to subscriptions, when we increase prices, when we do things like that, it's not just stuff in our pockets. We don't actually make a lot of profit as a business because we invest it all in hiring people, because the technical complexity of what we want to build is really high and really difficult, especially across 3 platforms. And so if someone likes something and helps someone else get it and download it and spend money on it, it's helping everyone involved receive a better product at the end of that. And that's because we don't have advertisers, we don't have investors, right? Like any investment we make in the product comes from the people voting with their wallets and telling us, here's $20, $30 a year now. Like, keep going. Like the extra money is going to go towards hiring more people who are going to help us build more complicated products that take longer to build.
Nice.